This is Political Animals.
Hello everyone and welcome to Political Animals, the editorial and opinion segment of the Commoners podcast. My name is Adam. Political animals is a term used by Aristotle to describe the natural human inclination to form political communities. John and I agree the two of us are naturally political creatures, but here we get a chance to run a little bit more wild than what we normally would be able to in the main podcast. I'm joined today by, well, no one. For this segment, John and I will be writing and recording separately, bringing you our own opinions in our own voices. I get the honour of introducing the segment, but this week it'll be John who will be delivering our first editorial as he tackles recent events surrounding the confirmation hearings in the US Senate. But first, a little raison d'etre for the segment. Political Animals aims to do two things. First, with a new episode of Commoners podcast dropping every other week, we were finding it difficult to stay up to date and relevant with so much happening in the political world of Brexit and, well, the new Trump administration. Between episodes 1 and 2 on the inauguration and patriotism, Trump had ordered an immigration ban, millions of women had taken to the street in protest, Trump's Supreme Court pick was announced, there were more protests, a mosque in Quebec City was attacked, and the immigration ban was overturned only to be met with a failed challenge. And that's just North America. In Europe, the French presidential frontrunner became embroiled in financial scandal. Thousands of people in Iceland and Greenland mourned the death of Birna, one of the few victims of violent crime in Iceland, a country that has on average 2 murders a year. And the Article 50 process passed its first hurdle in the UK Parliament. As former Prime Minister Harold Wilson once said, a week is a long time in politics, and to miss 2, well, that's just unideal. So in the first few minutes of the Political Animals segment, we'll bring you up to date on the week's news from around the world. Second, and more importantly, each week we'll take some time to develop and deliver our own ideas in an opinion piece. John and I will trade spots every other week to deliver an editorial on a story, an event, or an idea that stood out to us during the week. We hope that these opinion pieces are useful in our overall goal of exploring the way forward for the progressive left, and we hope most of all that you enjoy them. So, on with the show. The news from Europe. On Wednesday night, the UK Parliament voted in favour again of the Article 50 bill. Last week's initial vote in favour of a second reading was the first hurdle for the Brexit bill, but after a week of committee debate and failed attempt by opposition parties to amend it, the Brexit bill passed its third reading with 494 in favour, 122 against. It now gets sent to the Lords for, well, more debate. Failed amendments included attempts to get all foreign nations, that is Scotland, England, Wales and Northern Ireland's approval on the final deal, to force a government to keep Parliament abreast of EU exit negotiations, to give MPs a final say on the final Brexit deal, and to guarantee the right to stay for all EU citizens already living in the UK. But all of these were defeated by the Conservative majority in the Parliament, leaving Article 50 negotiations in the hand of a Theresa May government without the scrutiny and ultimate final approval of the Parliament. So, hard Brexit, here we come. Meanwhile in Germany, polling indicates that the biggest threat to Angela Merkel's re-election as Chancellor in this September's parliamentary elections could come from her centre-left coalition partner. Merkel's centre-right Christian Democratic Union is in a grand coalition with the largest opposition party, the Social Democratic Party. Polling this month shows that the two parties are within 3 points of each other, closer than at any point since the last election in 2013, in which the CDU enjoyed a 16% lead over the SPD. The SPD candidate for Chancellor, Martin Schulz, if he can pull off an unexpected win and unseat Merkel, Brexit negotiations for Theresa May become much more difficult. Schulz believes strongly in a federal EU and remains staunchly against any favourable deal for the UK as Brexit negotiations commence, unlike Merkel, who many say was softening her tone towards a post-Brexit UK. Finally, speaking of polls, a new independence poll has been released in Scotland. A BMG poll has found that 49% of Scots are now in favour of independence, up 4 points from the 2014 referendum outcome. Similarly, the no or union vote is reportedly at 51%, 4 points below the 2014 outcome. While not yet meeting even the 50% mark, this is the largest significant increase in support for independence since June, around the time of the Brexit vote itself. On top of all this, Reuters reports of rumours swirling of a second independence referendum being floated for August 2018. as well as inside reports that the UK government is preparing for a request from the Scottish government to hold such a referendum. We'll see what happens. That's all from Europe this week. John, it's over to you.
Thanks, Adam. I think I'm going to start with some good news. A federal appeals court has declined to reinstate Donald Trump's immigration ban. In a unanimous decision, the panel of 3 judges from the San Francisco-based 9th U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals declined to block a lower court ruling that suspended the immigration ban and allowed previously barred travelers to enter the U.S. An appeal to the Supreme Court is possible. In fact, it seems likely. Shortly after the ruling was announced, Donald Trump tweeted out, quote, "See you in court. The security of our nation is at stake." It'll be interesting to see what happens with the court currently split 4-4, seeing as how Neil Gorsuch is yet to be confirmed. If, however, the Supreme Court were to split 4-4, it would automatically uphold the lower court ruling, meaning that the immigration ban would be null and void. In other non-political news, which seems to be somewhat of a defeat for Donald Trump, Nordstrom has announced that they will no longer carry Ivanka Trump's clothing line, citing poor sales. This, of course, prompted the president to attack Nordstrom on Twitter, and interestingly enough, Kellyanne Conway has found herself in some hot water for seemingly directing people to buy Ivanka's clothing. A clear conflict of interest which many people think has violated some serious ethics rules. However, it's not all bad news for Donald Trump this week, who saw a couple of his nominees for cabinet positions confirmed this week. All I can say is that it's a sad day for grizzly bears everywhere, and probably for the rest of America too. Donald Trump's nominee for Secretary of Education and billionaire Sarah Palin impersonator Betsy DeVos was confirmed by the Senate in a 51-50 vote. The vote was historic, and not just because someone with absolutely no relevant experience was put in charge of one of the nation's most important departments, but also because it was the first time a vice president had to break a tie to confirm a nominee. The vote was split almost entirely down party lines, with only 2 Republicans voting against and no Democrats voting for. DeVos has been criticized heavily for being completely unqualified for the position. Critics also claim that DeVos will use her power to dismantle public education in favor of private and charter schools. And there's good reason to think that. DeVos has never attended a public school, she hasn't sent her children to public school, she's never worked in a public school, written curriculum, or worked in education in any capacity at all. She also once referred to her work reforming education as advancing God's kingdom. She has also shown sympathy towards intelligent design, which is code word for creationism. And just when you thought it couldn't get any worse, President Trump's nominee for Attorney General, Jeff Sessions, was confirmed by a Senate vote of 52-47. The vote capped a bitter battle which saw Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell invoke Rule 19, an obscure Senate rule which disallows senators from, quote, impugning the motives and conduct of fellow senators. Senator Warren was stopped from reading a letter written by Coretta Scott King, which opposed Sessions' nomination to be a federal judge in 1986. I can't overstate how unhappy it makes me that these 2 were confirmed by the Senate. How disappointed it makes me in the supposed leaders of this country. Here's the truth. Betsy DeVos shouldn't be anywhere near the Department of Education. She has no experience working in education. She doesn't even believe in public education. She doesn't believe in the separation of church and state. She thinks that guns should be allowed in some schools, and possibly all schools, we really don't know. She doesn't believe in Common Core standards. She plagiarized some of her written responses in her confirmation hearings. She doesn't even understand basic terminology like the difference between proficiency and growth, which I knew what those were before this even happened. And I'm not even in education. I don't work in education. I just have friends who are teachers. She also seemed fundamentally ignorant of important federal laws regarding education. How can we expect her to enforce these laws and to lead the department in a direction that is beneficial for our public schools if she doesn't even understand how our public schools operate? Simply, she's an oligarch. There's no other way to say it. She's used her money and prestige to secure herself a position in the Trump administration. It's that simple. Granted, she is a privatization hawk, so the Republicans probably would have confirmed her if she was a cardboard cutout. But I'm sure it doesn't hurt that her and her family have donated over $200 million to Republicans over the years. It's absolutely sickening. I hope Trump is okay with the reversal of his travel ban because it looks like the only source of educated, skilled labor is going to have to come from immigration. And that's to say nothing of Jeff Sessions, the man who was just confirmed as Attorney General of the United States, the man who is in charge of enforcing the laws at the highest level in the courts in our country. Let's take a brief look, just a snapshot of the type of person that we're dealing with here. I have to give credit to Kyle Kulinski at Secular Talk. He did a wonderful 30-minute segment on Jeff Sessions and his entire voting record. I've picked a few of the best examples out here to review. Mr. Sessions has voted for all of the following. He voted to ban women crossing state lines for abortions. It's one thing for these conservatives who are states' rights advocates to say, leave abortions up to the state. Don't have the Supreme Court deciding whether or not we should make it legal. I don't agree, but I understand the logic. But the intent of this law is to make it so that women can't get abortions even if they live in a state bordering a state that allows them. Literally, they would ban women from going across state lines to get care that they need. He voted no on reauthorizing the Violence Against Women Act, which needs no explanation. He voted yes on a constitutional ban for gay marriage. He wants to put into the Constitution of the United States a definition of marriage being between a man and a woman. He voted no on adding LGBT communities to the hate crimes protections list. He voted yes to ban flag burning. Apparently, our Attorney General doesn't believe in the fundamentals of free speech. Even Antonin Scalia, one of the most conservative right-wing Supreme Court justices in history, understands that burning the American flag, while abhorrent to some, is and must be protected free speech. He voted for the Patriot Act. He voted to expand NSA spying with more wiretapping without warrants. He voted yes on increasing punishments for drug crimes. He is famously quoted as saying, "Good people don't smoke marijuana." He also once joked that he used to be okay with the KKK, but then he found out that some of them smoke marijuana. He voted yes on barring the EPA from regulating greenhouse gases. Literally, the one thing that the EPA is supposed to do. He voted against expanding stem cell research. He voted yes on the war in Iraq. He voted against banning chemical weapons. Apparently, he's okay with the United States having them, just nobody else. He voted yes on allowing lobbyists to give gifts to Congress, which is obviously not a conflict of interest at all. He voted no on allowing Medicare to negotiate with drug companies for lower prices, directly harming senior citizens in this country. He voted yes on privatizing Social Security. If we had privatized Social Security, what do you think would have happened to all the elderly people's savings accounts when 2008 happened? He voted yes on the Bush tax cuts. And that's just a quick snapshot of his voting record. Outside of what I've highlighted here, he gets a grade of 20% from the ACLU, which means 80% of the time he votes against civil liberties. He gets a grade of 7% from the NAACP, meaning that 93% of the time he votes against legislation that would help African American communities. He gets a grade of 0 from the Human Rights Campaign, which means literally he's never voted in favor of gay rights. And perhaps scariest of all, he's graded A+ by the NRA. I think we get a good picture of what's going on here. Donald Trump is nominating crazy people. He's nominating extremists to very, very important positions in this country. Jeff Sessions, the man who says that good people don't smoke marijuana, now has the ability to shut down individual states which have legalized it, like Massachusetts, where I live. I am and have always been a huge supporter of people's right to smoke marijuana. But now, Mr. Sessions, if he wants to, which it seems he does, he could come in and shut everything down because marijuana is illegal at the federal level. This from the man who voted not to allow women to cross state lines for abortions. This man who nominally supports states' rights may be in a position where he could deny our state our rights. And that doesn't even mention the accusations of racism. We have a right-wing extremist as Attorney General who seems in lockstep with Trump on almost everything. Do you think that in any way he's going to uphold liberal, progressive values in the courts? Absolutely not. He has no history of doing that, and every indication is to a right-wing extremist agenda. I don't know what's worse. Him, who we know is at least somewhat qualified, who has a horrible agenda and has the means to go about implementing that agenda, or Betsy DeVos, who has absolutely no idea what she's doing. We are putting the future of our children in the hands of somebody who literally does not believe in the future of our education system. She wants to privatize all education. She wants to get rid of public schools and apply market forces to the education of our children. We already have public schools, literally. I hear stories all the time of my friends who are teachers having to buy classroom supplies by themselves. They aren't supplied through the school. They actually have to go out and buy these supplies. The funding of our education system is completely broken, and yet we're told by making these schools have to compete for tax dollars with private institutions that somehow that's going to raise the quality of education in the United States. It just hasn't happened. It just has not happened. So what's going to happen now is poor communities that don't have a large tax base, poor communities that don't perform well, they're going to start falling farther and farther behind. We're in a bad spot right now. A bad spot. We have extremists taking over our government on almost every level. We have Steve Bannon on the National Security Council. We have Donald Trump, who is President of the United States. And that doesn't even get to one of the more disturbing parts of what happened this week. I mentioned briefly that Mitch McConnell instituted a rare rule, Rule 19. I'll be honest, I follow politics very closely, and I've never heard of this. I've never heard of this actually happening. Basically, during the confirmation vote for Jeff Sessions, basically what happened was Elizabeth Warren decided to get up and read a letter by Coretta Scott King, the wife of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Back in 1986, Jeff Sessions was nominated for a federal judge position, and she wrote a letter opposing his nomination. Senator Warren tried to read this letter, and Mitch McConnell, I'm sure, knowing what was in the letter, knowing that it would be damning, decided to invoke this rule. This rule says that you cannot impugn the character, or not the character, you cannot impugn the motives and the actions of a fellow senator. This outdated rule. You can't actually call somebody out for what they do. They're bullshit. You can't call them out on the Senate floor. Talk about a safe space. They silenced Elizabeth Warren. They actually made her leave the floor. They wouldn't let her read it. It was the most relevant thing in the world to be read at that time, and they would not let her read it. But it backfired. Just like every attempt to limit free speech backfires. I say this about leftists, I say this about Antifa, I say this about regressive social justice warriors who try to silence people that they disagree with, people who protest and punch people at UC Berkeley when Milo Yiannopoulos comes to speak. If you try to silence people's speech, it loudens it. It loudens it. Milo Yiannopoulos, his sales of his book are going to go through the roof now. His ratings are going to go through the roof. He's going to get way more attention now than he ever would have without you throwing a hissy fit and trying to silence him because you don't agree with what he's saying. Rather than, I don't know, doing that, why don't you actually try to address what he's saying? Now, in the case of Mitch McConnell, he's utterly incapable of addressing what Elizabeth Warren is saying because Elizabeth Warren is right. And he's afraid of that. So he silences her on the Senate floor. He silences her. And what happens now? There's a meme going around. Millions of people are aware of this now. Millions of people are gathering around Elizabeth Warren and celebrating the fact that she persisted. We live in a country now with a government whose leaders are perfectly fine silencing opposition on the Senate floor and not worrying about it. But they should be worried about it because people are aware now of basically what's going on. And it is bullshit. It needs to stop now. This is classic Republican tactics. Classic. They have no argument against what she was going to say. They know about Jeff Sessions. They know the type of person he is. And the only way to stop these facts from coming out on national television are to try to silence the person saying them. Well, it didn't work. Just like it never works. It never works when you try to silence somebody else. Hopefully this will galvanize people, because we are not at this point. We are not sufficiently galvanized. I know at some point we're going to talk about Justice Democrats, which I think is a great movement, but overall, how did we get to this point? How did we get to this point? We've allowed it to get to where Jeff Sessions is now our Attorney General, Donald Trump is our President, Betsy DeVos is the Secretary of Education, Rex Tillerson is the Secretary of State, Ben Carson, of all people, who knows how to cut brains into pieces, and he's an excellent neurosurgeon, yes, but he has no public policy experience, and now he is the head of housing and urban development. Why? Because he lives in a house? Does that make him qualified? We now have a government of oligarchs. They're not qualified, but they're in the positions that they have because our government and our system is broken, completely and utterly broken. And we need to fix that. And the only way that we'll be able to fix it is to move in a progressive, liberal direction, because everything else that's going on right now is an absolute dumpster fire. The left needs to wake up, and we need to wake up now. Thanks for listening to the first run of Political Animals. If you like this segment, don't forget to subscribe to us at Commoners Pod on Twitter, and actually try to listen to our normal podcast. The music for today's episode is Drive by Otis McDonald.